Hi, we continue in 1 Kings 3 with one of the strangest stories not only in the monarchy, but the entire Bible, where King Solomon, newly enthroned and having had a dream that God gave him power, does the only public act he does in his entire reign, other than the temple dedication ceremony, to resolve a maternity suit between two street prostitutes. And yet, almost all commentators just take it as given that this is something he does, it demonstrates his wisdom, and it would be a more or less normal thing for a king to do. But is it? If it was normal, how come it's the only time anything like this happens in the entire history of the monarchy, covering over 400 years? Although there are a couple of other similar stories that we'll look at in a minute that suggest how to read this and what's really going on here. But it's certainly the only story like this in the Solomon story. And beyond that, the only live women, there are women referred to, but the only live women in the entire story, and some other elements of it that are strange and unusual. As you can see on the right side of the screen, where we see the key words that are repeated so many times in this passage, but are not anywhere else in the chapter, other than house 3 times at the very beginning, the house of Yahweh and the house of the king, etc. And yet, house, house, house in these first verses here, where it's not really relevant directly to the story, and living and dead, and son, 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 son as well. So the key words and the connection with the beginning give us a hint that there's something more going on here. But I'd like to suggest that when we look at the larger narrative context, which takes us back to the David story in 2 examples, because certainly readers at whatever time, unless they were the very first readers when this may have been a separate document, understood Solomon as succeeding his father David and David succeeding Saul. So that whole story has to be in the mind of people reading this. Otherwise, the story, as we'll see, doesn't really make much sense. It just seems like an out-of-place example that is just there and there's nothing more to say about it. But there's a lot to say about it. And so in this video, I'm going to explain why I think it's important to read this not on the surface, but as an allegory of the monarchy as a whole, with the 2 sons as Israel and Judah, or at least the monarchies, the sons as Saul and David and Solomon, and the 2 whores, the 2 women as Israel and Judah. And next video, with that under our belt, we'll actually go through the story, which is relatively simple. As you can see, there are not many unusual Hebrew words, and it's all pretty straightforward and unambiguous, which is unusual for Hebrew, as we've seen. So let's start off with right in the beginning. The narrative context, as I was noting last time, if I scroll up a verse so we can see how the last scene ended, after the dream, which Solomon apparently told no one, but he must have told someone or it wouldn't be in the text here, he offered up burnt offerings and had a drinking feast for his servants without apparently explaining to them what that was for, and then suddenly it shifts. We just simply hear later, using the Hebrew setting the following in unspecified time. Let's just look briefly at a couple of things that scholars have done recently so we can see what the issue is. Garciel, an Israeli scholar, engages the story narratively, so he doesn't try to find sources and various things, but never takes it beyond the surface. Hayes, whose book is about the question of whether the story is meant to praise Solomon or to bury him, says, in the context of the upcoming civil war between Judah and Israel, the struggle for the throne and the immediate lapse into foreign idolatry, the story is rather suggestive, unquote. But then he doesn't say anything more about it. Another commentator notes perhaps the fact that Solomon was able to hold the kingdom together throughout his reign was one of his major accomplishments. And that's certainly true, but not connected to this story. And there's one other parallel, which is a dark and ugly story, but I'm going to look at it because of its similarity. Way late in 2 Kings, during the famine in Samaria, the capital city of the nation of Israel, of course, long after it divided, but before the Assyrian takeover, where we see this ugly story. But notice the similarity with what we see here. Now, as the king of Israel was walking on the city wall, a woman cried out to him, "Help, my lord king." And I might as well point out to it now that we can see that similarity with the story back in 2 Samuel 14, where we hear the exact same starting phrase, "Help, O king," without Lord there. So, "Help, my lord king." And he said, "No, let Yahweh help you. How can I help you?" Again, this is during a famine. But the king asked her, "What is your complaint?" And she said, "This woman said to me, 'Give up your son. We will eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give up your son, and we will eat him.' But she has hidden her son." And the king hears these words and decides what to do. So a very similar story of a woman coming in an argument about 2 sons. Obviously, the eating the son as an already done deal is parallel to the son already being dead here, but in a much uglier sort of way. So that's certainly one element to suggest that there's a form of the story that we're seeing more than once within the story of the monarchy. As I was noting here, Nashim, the plural for women, is only live women in the entire story. we saw Abishag referred to, and Adonijah wanted his mother, or wanted Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, to get Abishag for him. And we saw reference to her. We saw the reference in the beginning of this chapter to Pharaoh's daughter. And we'll see references to other women as precisely as wives, but never live in the story. So that's another element, that these two women are the only live women in the story. And they're immediately described as zonot, prostitutes, which is the only time we hear them in this story, not surprisingly. But let's look at the role of them throughout. So if we look at this little chart, we'll see how the prophets, starting with Isaiah, portray Israel and Judah, sometimes simply as Jerusalem, as whores for practicing idolatry, but also for going after others than Yahweh. So let's just look through some of those so we can see how this could well be the basis for what we're seeing in our immediate passage. So simply, as we see in Isaiah, the first chapter, how the faithful city, plainly Jerusalem, has become a whore. She was full of justice and righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. So they're not about idolatry, but about violence and lack of social justice. Near the very end of Isaiah, we hear, "But as for you, Israel, come here, you children of a sorceress, you offspring of an adulterer and a whore." As an offspring, that would suggest they're children of another god, and as an adulterer and a woman with that, but certainly playing the whore that way. Then in Jeremiah, we hear a short example and a long example. Notice the under every green tree, which is something like the Bama, the high places. We see it again down here, every high hill and under every green tree, suggesting that what's at issue is worshiping in the wrong place, not in Jerusalem, but also suggesting other gods. So we see that in the beginning of Jeremiah 2:20. You broke your yoke and burst your bond. You said, "I will not serve," which is to say, not serve Yahweh. And then we see this longer example from Jeremiah. "If a man divorces his woman and she goes from him and becomes another man's woman, will he return to her? Would not such a land be greatly polluted?" Note that the rhetorical question is about a human situation, but plainly it's meant as an analogy to the national situation. You, Israel, played the whore with many lovers. And notice the refrain of playing the whore, playing the whore, playing the whore. And we'll see the same phrase in Ezekiel a little bit later. And I won't go through all the details of that. I'll post this at radicalbible.net and you can read it for yourself. But you see repeated over and over about Israel and her false sister Judah also playing the whore. So here, Israel playing the whore, and false sister Judah saw it, and she replicated the same behavior. Then we see in Ezekiel, speaking from exile, "Those of you from Judah who escape shall remember me," Yahweh of course, "among the nations where they are carried captive," such as Babylon, "how I was crushed by their whoring heart and their whoring eyes that turned after idols." And then we see the long passage in Ezekiel 16, and we could really see the whole chapter where Israel, or Jerusalem, is portrayed as a street whore raising her skirts for passersby. And I won't read the whole thing, but you can see that right here. "Lavished your whorings on their passersby. You took some of your garments and made for yourself colorful shrines, and on them played the whore." And over again, you played the whore with the Assyrians because you were insatiable. You played the whore with them, and still not satisfied, you multiplied your whoring with Chaldea, the land of merchants, which is to say Babylon. So plainly, the international relationships are an issue here. Hosea has Yahweh tell him to marry a woman of whoredom, and again, some scholars take that literally, as if Hosea was actually literally going out to marry a whore. But that's the master metaphor of the whole book of Hosea, where the land commits great whoredom by forsaking Yahweh. So the point is that Hosea is taking the position of Yahweh as being married, if you will, to a whore, in the covenant image of Yahweh and the people of Israel being a married couple, and therefore Israel being adulterous in one level or a whore at another level. So these are all examples of how the prophets look on the situation and see the nations as playing whore. There are actually very few situations of individual whores in the Bible. There are some. I won't play that out. But plainly, this is just presented here in our chapter like it's just normal, like there's nothing to be worried about that, and he's not apparently repelled by it. There's no crowd that says, "How dare you disturb the king, you lowly so-and-sos?" And there doesn't appear to be anybody else there at all. So there they are at the beginning. And one of the interesting elements that we can see too is when they begin to tell the story, she says she laid him at her breast, using the Hebrew hike here, which recalls the ewe lamb parable from 2 Samuel 12, where there the rich man and the poor man, and the ewe lamb and the traveler were at issue. And the rich man took the ewe lamb from the poor man and gave it to the traveler. But we heard there that the poor man had kept the ewe lamb like a daughter at his table, and she lay at his breast. And that's the only other previous use of breast until we get to it here. And there's only two other instances of it in the entire Deuteronomistic history. So plainly, the only women in the entire Solomon story, prostitutes as commonly referring to the nations of Israel and Judah, the breast calling us back to this story, and the parallel with the woman of Tekoa and the story later about the two women coming to the king during the famine. So what I'd like to suggest at issue is, we've already seen two stories that were parables, or allegories, if you will. This is the one from 2 Samuel 12 that Yahweh told Nathan to tell. We don't hear that Yahweh told Nathan to tell the parable, but Yahweh told Nathan something about David, and then Nathan told David the parable, and David fell for the parable. He says the one who took the ewe lamb from the poor man ought to be destroyed, and Nathan said, "You are the man." And so we already saw one story like this where it can be read as a parable, and as this chart shows, a master parable of the entire monarchy from the time of conquest to the time of exile, fitting into this pattern. And I've gone over that when we looked at 2 Samuel 12. You can watch the video for it there. And again, this is posted at radicalbible.net. So that's one story. And then simply 2 chapters later is this story. And this is plainly a false story. Joab went to Tekoa to get this woman to tell the story in order to get David to wake up to the situation about Absalom fomenting rebellion just outside the royal palace and in the streets. And David falls for it again. But notice how this story that we looked at there is very similar to the Cain and Abel story, certainly coming later. Much as I was noting in the dream that just precedes this, it evokes the Garden of Eden story in terms of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So here was the story. Your servant had 2 sons, and I color-coded this to match the color coding that you can see here in our immediate story around house and son and died there. So your servant had 2 sons, and instead of one eating the other, etc., there being 2 separate women, they fought with one another in the field, and one struck the other and killed him, much like Cain did to Abel. And now the family has risen up against him, seeking blood vengeance. And he falls for it again. He says, "Go to your house and I'll give orders concerning you." And she says, "On me be the guilt, my lord the king." And soon after that he said, "Is the hand of Joab with you in this?" So eventually he gets it and he responds to the Absalom situation. By the time we get to our story, when we hear a strange story like this with women telling a story about sons, ought we not to be suspicious that it should be read as an allegory in one way or another and not just simply as an immediate situation? And so many elements of the story that suggest that. But we're not done yet. Because what about the whole business of house here? The business of house echoes here the question of house, which is the theme of the entire Solomon story, building the house of Yahweh, which will be at the center of not quite at the center, but at the climax of Solomon's reign. And the book of Chronicles, which takes out all the interesting stuff about Bathsheba and Uriah and all those things, makes the entire creation from Genesis 1 point toward the building of the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem. And that becomes the climax of the entire books of Chronicles. So we certainly know the theme of house, which we already noted was echoed from 2 Samuel 7, when we saw the play on house as a building or house as a dynasty. And we see the similar thing here. Because otherwise, why does this story need to emphasize so much of this? And if we just listen to the first few verses, which we'll go over in the next video, notice the stylized nature of how this is reported and how we cannot avoid hearing the repetition. So the one woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. We were together. There was no one else with us in the house. Only the 2 of us were in the house. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your slave slept," which is highlighting the fact that she can't possibly know that. The king ought to go, "Wait a minute. If you were asleep, how do you know that she switched the sons in the night?" And that's what happened. And scholars sometimes question that and sometimes don't. So that's another narrative thing that suggests there's something else going on here. But I'd like to suggest the same house here is the house of Yahweh, not as the building which hasn't been built yet, but as this covenant relationship between them. And the two women represent Israel and Judah struggling over the monarchy. So the house is their entire community of people, not the physical building, but not with a king necessarily. But the sons represent that. And one more example to highlight that. If we go back to the very beginning of the pre-monarchy story, in the beginning of 1 Samuel, as Robert Polzin laid out so well way back in the 90s, we can see this original story here, you see on the left side of the screen from 1 Samuel 1, as the master metaphor of the whole monarchy, with a man who has two wives and one of them has no children. And the other wife is harassing her over that, and we can see that as Israel and Judah, and one of those has a monarchy and the other one doesn't. And as we see here, a rival used to provoke her severely to irritate her because Yahweh had closed her womb. It went on year by year as often as she went up to the house of Yahweh. And we see the house of Yahweh back there, which is plainly not the Jerusalem temple, which hasn't been built at all, but referred to here in a very specific way. And it's referred to as a very specific way a couple more times in the book of Samuel around the time of David, without obviously referring to the house of Yahweh, which is going to be built in our immediate story. So she went up to this unspecified location of the house of Yahweh. This is not in Jerusalem. Who used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And her husband Elkanah said to her this, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not worth more to you than 10 sons? Or am I not more to you than 10 sons? And as we'll see when we return to our immediate passage, later when Solomon loses the monarchy, it's exactly 10 tribes that are taken away from him and given to Jeroboam, representing Israel. And so are those 10 sons 10 tribes back there, 10 leaders of individual tribal situations, or a sequence of 10 kings or something else? We can't go back and explore that in detail as Polzin does, writing a whole book on 1 Samuel. But it's certainly suggesting that the sense of sons is a representation of monarchy, which they literally are, with Solomon being the son of David. And as he said in the dream to Yahweh, or to Elohim, whoever we want to hear is speaking to him, you've preserved my father who walked in your ways and gave him a son. And so, which we can see up here, gave him a son. And so there are many elements of this that suggest that the story should be read that way. And so stay tuned, and we'll go through the story next time with all that in mind and see what it might be saying about the two monarchies and Solomon's wisdom. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.